God is a call to adventure with some constraints.
A call to true adventure.
To true adventure.
True adventure. Yeah, and then that's a good observation, because that begs the question, what constitutes the most true adventure? Well, that's not fully fleshed out until, at least from the Christian perspective, let's say, that's not fully fleshed out until the Gospels, because the passion of Christ is you could say, this is the perfectly reasonable way of looking at it, the passion of Christ is the truest adventure of Abraham. That's a terrible thing, eh? Because the passion story is a catastrophic tragedy, although it obviously has its redemptive elements. But one of the things that's implied there is that there's no distinction between the true adventure of life and taking on the pathway of maximal responsibility and burden. And I can't see how that cannot be true. Like, because the counter hypothesis is, well, Lex, the best thing for you to do in your life is to shrink from all challenge and hide, right? To remain infantile, to remain secure, not to ever push yourself beyond your limits, not to take any risks. Well, no one thinks that's true.
So basically, the maximally worthwhile adventure could possibly be highly correlated with the hardest possible available adventure.
The hardest possible available adventure voluntarily undertaken.
Does it have to be
voluntary? It has
voluntary?
to be absolutely.
How do you define voluntarily?
Well, here's an example of that. That's a good question too. When Christ is the night before the crucifixion, which in principle he knows is coming, he asks God to relieve him of his burden, and understandably so. I mean, that's the scene famously in which he's sweating, literally sweating blood, because he knows what's coming. And the Romans designed crucifixion to be the most agonizing and humiliating possible. Agonizing, humiliating, and disgusting possible death. Right, so there was every reason to be apprehensive about that. And you might say, well, could you undertake that voluntarily as an adventure? And the answer to that is something like, well, what's your relationship with death? Like, that's a problem you have to solve. And you could fight it, and you could be bitter about it, and there's reasons for that, especially if it's painful and degrading. But the alternative is something like, well, it's what's fleshed out in religious imagery always. It's very difficult to cast into words. It's like, no, you welcome the struggle. That's why I called the book We Who Wrestle with God. You welcome the struggle. And Lex, I don't see how you can come to terms with life without construing it as something like, bring it on, welcome the struggle. And I can't see that there's a limit to that. It's like, well, I welcome the struggle until it gets difficult. Well,
so there's not a bell curve, like the struggle in moderation. Basically, you have to welcome whatever as hard as it gets. And the crucifixion in that way is a symbol
of that. Well, and it's worse than that in some ways, because the crucifixion exemplifies the worst possible death. But that isn't the only element of the struggle, because mythologically, classically, after Christ's death, he harrows hell. And what that means, as far as I can tell, psychologically, is that you're not only required, let's say, to take on the full existential burden of life and to welcome it, regardless of what it is, and to maintain your upward aim despite all temptations to the contrary, but you also have to confront the root of malevolence itself. So it's not merely tragedy. And I think the malevolence is actually worse. And the reason I think that is because I know the literature on post-traumatic stress disorder. And most people who encounter, let's say, a challenge that's so brutal that it fragments them, it isn't mere suffering that does that to people. It's an encounter with malevolence that does that to people. Their own sometimes, often, by the way. Soldier will go out into a battlefield and find out that there's a part of him that really enjoys the mayhem. And that conceptualization doesn't fit in well with everything he thinks he knows about himself and humanity. And after that contact with that dark part of himself, he never recovers. That happens to people. And it happens to people who encounter bad actors in the world too. If you're a naive person and the right narcissistic psychopath comes your way, you are in like mortal trouble because you might die, but that's not where the trouble ends.